Hey, my friend, welcome to the Battle for the Mind Ministries. I'm your host, Kendall Walker. If it's your first time here, it's a pleasure. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the little bell and subscribing. This ministry is dedicated to teaching the Bible, theology, apologetics, answering frequently asked questions, and much, much more. And best of all, it's all Bible-based. Hello and welcome to Battle for the Mind. So far, we've been looking at the book of Genesis, and we've covered chapters 1 through 3 using our acronym in the beginning, covering the first 14 chapters of the book of Genesis. Today, we're going to look at chapter 4, which we've entitled Hatred and the First Murder, using the acronym H. Hatred and the First Murder. Now, everybody's familiar with the story about Cain and Abel, and if you're not familiar, just simply go back to the previous lesson where we dealt with the first family and looked at this with some depth. And which leads me to the question, why is this story, why is this placement so significant? And the reason why it's significant is because chapter 3 records the root of sin, hence Adam and Eve's fall, whereas chapter 4 presents the fruit of sin, the result of that fall. In other words, chapter 4 shows the spread of sin in Adam's family and on into larger society. We've got to remind ourselves of this. Cain was the first murderer, whereas Abel is the first martyr. And as you read not only the book of Genesis, but continue on through the Bible and ending up in Revelation, one sees that spiral of wickedness taking place where man has become more and more wicked. Well, how do we know this? Well, we go back to, like we always do, the Bible. Having said that, let's dive in. How do we know that man's become more and more evil? Well, listen to God as Moses records the words of God in Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Again, that speaks to the heart of man. Now, what lesson can we learn from that? Well, we can learn this. Human self-absorption always leads to violence. I want you to think about this chapter 4, and verses 1 through 16. We see the fall having affected not only Adam and Eve and their children, but themselves. And then in verses 17 through 26, we trace what became of Cain and Seth and their descendants. What makes it so interesting is that this chapter begins and ends with the subject or the topic of worship. Just go back and look at chapter 4, verse 1, and then the last verse in chapter 4, verse 26, and you'll see exactly what we're talking about, how this chapter begins and ends on the subject of worship. It's also interesting that God had warned Adam and Eve about sin. We see that all through chapter 3. And even with that, what happens? Cain turns around and murders his brother. Again, that just speaks to the depravity of man and man's heart. And as we talked about earlier in chapter 6, verse 5, how man became more and more wicked. Not only that, remember, it is God describing the condition of man in chapter 6, verse 5. Now, as I look at this particular chapter, there are 4 things that make this chapter very interesting. Let me go through those one at a time. Number 1, names. Hebrew names show significance. It's kind of like, you ever see those Indian movies where person's name is Running Bear? Why? Because he's strong, he can run very fast. Well, the same applies here, where the word Cain, or the name Cain, means possession. Why is that interesting? Why is it significant? Because what is Cain trying to do? He is trying to possess his brother in all that his brother is doing. Here's something even more interesting. The word or name Abel means vapor. Vapor is something that appears and is gone. In fact, the Bible uses the idea of a vapor as a short span of life. Hence, what do we have? We have Cain, the possessor, taking Abel's life, cutting it short, i.e. the vapor. Secondly, what we have within this chapter is, and the rest of the book of Genesis, we have a continuation of sibling rivalries plaguing each of the godly families in the book of Genesis. You just go through the book and you look at all the godly families that are there, and what do you have? You've got sibling rivalry, going against one another constantly, continually. Again, it's just a tragedy because it speaks to the heart and nature of man. Number 3, we have God graciously providing protection for Cain in response to his complaint. Again, keep in mind what happened. Cain turns around and kills his brother Abel. God implements protection for Cain, and what does Cain do? He continues to respond in a negative fashion. And then number 4, we have Cain denying responsibility for his sin and objecting to God's punishment. Isn't that so much like humans? The bottom line is this: humans just do not want to take responsibility for their actions. They don't want to be held accountable. I think that's one of the reasons why so many atheists are around today, because they don't want to be held accountable for what they do. Well, what can we learn from this? What can we learn from chapter 4? And again, I'm going to encourage you to go back and get more detail as far as the interaction between Cain and Abel in our previous video. But here's the question: what can we learn? I think we can learn basically 3 things here. We can learn, first of all, that sin is more firmly entrenched in the human heart than one can imagine. Let me say that again. That sin is more firmly entrenched in the human heart than we can really imagine. People like to do this when it comes to accountability. They say, well, I'm not as bad as my neighbor, or I'm not as bad as somebody else. But the reality is, guess what? We had Adam and Eve living in a perfect environment, and what did they do? They sinned. They decided to do what? Go against God. Now we've got Cain and Abel, and what happened there? The exact same thing. Cain sinned, and hence he killed his brother. Why is that? Well, I think the book of 1 John gives us that answer. Go with me to 1 John chapter 3. 1 John chapter 3, we're going to look at verses 11 and 12. 1 John chapter 3, verses 11 and 12. In fact, verse 11 actually begins the paragraph. The paragraph is very short. It's only 2 verses. Listen to what the Apostle John writes. He says, "For this is the message which we have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another." Listen carefully. "Not as Cain, who was the evil one, and slew his brother. And for what reason did he slay him?" Now John gives us the reason. Because his deeds were evil, and his brothers were righteous. His deeds were evil, and his brothers were righteous. And in fact, we should be reminded of the writer of Hebrews. In Hebrews chapter 11, he says this: "Without faith, it is impossible to please God." See, here's the thing. And there's number 3. Faith always presupposes divine revelation and our response to that. Why is that important? Because you can guarantee this, that Yahweh, God, had spoke to Adam and Eve. Hence, while they were in the garden, God had told them that he was going to provide for them. He provided protection. Even after they sinned, what did he provide? He provided skin from an animal. Therefore, they were able to clothe themselves because, remember, they were ashamed of their nakedness. And it was their responsibility to make sure that not only they followed God's ordinance as far as giving animal sacrifices to cover one's sin, but they were supposed to do the same thing with their kids and so forth, being taught all the way through scriptures that without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sin. That's the key. That's the key. Faith always presupposes divine revelation. Without faith, what? It's impossible to please God. Join us next time as we look at chapter 5. Until then, may God bless the reading of His Word.